Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to College S.W.A.A.P, Students with Awareness and Purpose, Engaging the Spectrum of Male Students. Tiffany, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. This is Josie McPherson. I'm from NSCASA, and welcome to our webinar. We're just going to jump right in. If anyone is having any technical difficulty, please contact me by email at jmcpherson, that's JMCPHERSON, at NSCASA.org, and I will walk you through it. But please don't call me because I'll be on this call. So at that, I will hand it over to Tiffany Brec from Vera House. Thank you, Tiffany.
Awesome. Thank you, Josie. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed the refreshments that you brought for yourself. And if you're not happy with the temperature of the room, please know that you have all the power to change it. And we're going to move through the conversation. And we encourage folks to ask questions through the chat box. If we say something that you would like us to elaborate on or you need clarification around, please feel free to pop that into the chat box, and we will make sure that we get to it. So for this webinar, obviously focusing on the importance of engaging men in the prevention of domestic and sexual violence. This topic it's been on people's radar for a while, but recently I think it's gained kind of more visibility, and there's been a bigger push around particularly campuses doing a lot more engaging men work, and so that led to us wanting this kind of conversation, or at least continuing the conversation, or what that looks like, you know, ways that has been successful for our program and ways that we continue to struggle as we move along. So my name is Tiffany Brec. I'm the campus project coordinator for the Vera House in Syracuse, New York. We work with 9 college campuses in the area, with SU being the largest and a campus like Bryan Stratton being the smallest. So you can see by the logos up on the screen that the campuses that we work with are pretty diverse. We have a couple medical universities, a couple private, some religious, and then public institutions. So we have to be really conscious before we do program, we do a program or a training, kind of who we are speaking to, who's going to be in the room, and what's the culture of the campus. All of those things are really important to take into consideration. And so I'm going to give my team a few minutes to go around and introduce themselves. We have a deep bench of talent.
My name is Chris Kazakowski. My pronouns are he, him, his. I will be your token male for today. Really excited to be able to talk about these issues. Yes.
My name is Hasnik Delakian, she, her pronouns, prevention educator.
My name is Kayla Walker, also she, her pronouns, and I'm also a prevention educator here at Vera House.
And my name is Natalie Parginoni, pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm an intern here at Vera House and a senior at Syracuse University.
Awesome. We are super excited that Natalie is with us today. This is actually her last day of her internship. So our going away present was for her to do more work, which is awesome. So as we move through the conversation, the topic, we're going to be kind of shifting who is leading each piece. So the goal of this is around engagement of college men in sexual and relationship violence prevention on campus and maintaining their involvement in that. Strategy, move engaging men efforts from this clustered approach to consistent. So a lot of times when we are talking about engaging men, we tend to go to male athletes or Greek life. And so for us, when we were having this conversation and planning for this, we acknowledge that as important as that is, we need to kind of move away from that approach if we're looking to truly engage a spectrum of men in this conversation. Objective, see a noticeable increase in participation of male college students in sexual and relationship violence prevention events, trainings, and campaigns.
So we'd like to ask you all to respond to this poll, if you wouldn't mind, just to get a sense of who's in the virtual space with us here, what your roles are, and what your entry points are into this line of work, so that we can make sure the material is in line with your work and what you're looking for. So if you could just take a moment for those who haven't responded yet to just indicate, do you work in advocacy and law enforcement, as a faculty person, Title IX coordinator, trainer, educator, and so on. So we'll just give you another couple seconds or several seconds. Cool. So it looks like we've got a range of folks in the space. Majority of whom are in Title IX work and faculty and advocacy work and training and education. We have some law enforcement folks and some other folks. So thank you for that. And just one more poll. We want to get a sense of typically how do you all do this kind of work? How do you typically engage male-identified students? Is it through classroom programming that's sort of students at large? Is it campus and community-wide events where you don't necessarily know who's going to be there and it's sort of targeted at the campus as a whole? Is it awareness-raising campaigns or targeted trainings, for instance, male athletes or Greek life and so on? Or are you unsure or other? And just feel free to check off all that apply. Take a few more seconds. Okay, thank you. So you all seem to do a pretty wide variety of things. That's great. Looks like the majority of folks do the campus and community-wide events and the targeted trainings, but there's definitely a range of different types of engagement. So thank you again.
Awesome. So one of the things, and we're just going to touch on this briefly right now, but something that we feel is really important as we move through the conversation when we're talking about engaging men. So this idea of what we mean when we say engagement and some of the things that are really key to doing true engagement in a way that connects to the audience and keeps them engaged in the conversation, maintaining their participation essentially. So this idea of assessment of the skills of facilitator. And so again, we'll do a deeper dive into this a little bit later, but this idea of really allowing for real human conversation. I think a lot of times when people are kind of the lead trainer or presenting, there is this expectation of perfection, and we kind of close ourselves off to truly connecting with our audiences, and that ends up having an impact. Rolling with resistance, know that most people, regardless of how they identify, are going to give us some level of resistance just based on how we've socialized people around these issues. And so as a facilitator, as that lead person, being able to roll with that resistance in a way that is effective. And so if someone is challenging you, how do you, I guess, make them maintain respect for you while also being able to share their feelings? So we don't want to shut people down. Model vulnerability and healthy communication, so allow yourself to connect with your audience, share certain pieces about yourself to enhance how you communicate. Assess who's in the audience and present information tailored to that group. And again, we'll talk about that a little more in detail later. For this, we also really want to highlight, and we know that it's difficult, and trust me, this is an area for our team that we have struggled. It's one of our barriers, but getting faculty and staff involved in this conversation, and that can look a variety of ways, but going beyond targeting, mainly white cis men, and so we need to kind of think outside the box a bit about what engagement is and who we end up talking to.
So a big piece that we kind of focus here on Vera House is with a facilitation, we usually do an activity to get who the audience is engaged. So in the spirit of that, we are going to do an activity as best we can through a webinar. So this activity is called Ban Words. And ban words really highlights how important it is to not just rely on like commonly used words and phrases to communicate ideas and strategies around engaging men in this type of work in sexual and relationship violence prevention. And it's important to encourage thinking beyond typical styles of engagement and to come up with new ways to engage college men in this work. Specifically, for example, like not just focusing on targeted populations, but focusing on like a spectrum of male-identified students and faculty. Also, accessibility of language is extremely important to always keep in mind with engaging college men. So this is like a big piece of where this activity comes from. So, for example, a term like toxic masculinity may not be accessible for every person. So it's why we ban some of these words. So, again, it's called Ban Words. So on the next slide, you'll notice we have a list of words. These are our banned words. So we're just asking if you could take a few minutes and draft a statement that explains engaging men on college campuses without using any of these banned words on the slide. After you drafted your statement, please submit it via the chat, and keep in mind we'll be reading some of them out loud. So yeah, just take a few minutes to draft a statement. And so just the words, once again, the banned words are athletes, fraternities, masculinity, toxic, strong, leaders, allies, power, privilege, women, dialogue, protect, bystander, gender, norms, and challenge. So again, just take a few minutes and draft a statement that explains engaging men without using these words. So these are some of our examples. If anyone's kind of struggling to come up with an example of how to explain engaging men, we actually realized that we use one of the banned words, so we understand that it is difficult to kind of think outside of the box and come up with these kind of new creative statements to engage men. So yeah, if you're having any difficulties, you can refer to these. So we have a few coming in. So one is, it's on us to create a healthy and safe campus culture. Another is, sexual violence affects everyone. Let's find a way to have men become part of the solution. It's a really good one. We have sexual violence is everyone's issue. Male college students age 18 to 24 are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than their male peers who are not in college. Sexual violence prevention efforts need men to engage and support all sexual violence survivors. And that's a statistic from RAIN. We have empowering people to make the world more equitable and safe. Calling on all men to engage in discussion about the prevention of sexual violence. We have create experiences for men to come together to discuss the opportunity they have in being a part of the solution of sexual violence. / dating and domestic violence. We have exploring male identity and building safe and equitable communities. We're opening the floor to listen to folks who may not feel like they have a space in the conversation around sexual violence. I'm going to touch on that a lot. Eliminate the stigma of who is involved in sexual violence. Okay, awesome. So thank you all for participating in that. Those are really awesome ways to creatively think about how we engage men. So yeah, so this activity can be used going forward and can be brought back to your agency / place of work to be utilized as like a new way to continually challenge yourself and your colleagues to come up with like new means of engagement. So really just thinking outside of the box and creating new ideas and challenging yourself to really kind of create a new way to think about engaging men.
In full disclosure, I wish we could take credit for the creation of this, but Target actually had this game. It is a real game that exists, and I encourage people to check it out. But then we just used it and tailored it to fit a need that we had. When we're talking about communication and engagement, really expanding the words that we use and how we frame things is really important. Because what works with one person or one audience isn't necessarily going to work with someone different or a different group of people.
Yeah, I think sometimes doing this work, knowing that it has been something that isn't a new conversation, we tend to get stuck into the same jargony styles of talking about engaging men work. And really when we're trying to focus on bringing new men to the table, we have to find new ways to even talk about and frame the stuff. So that way when we're marketing programs and trainings or trying to have staff and faculty be more involved, finding something that's really going to bring people in and you know, catch their attention in a way that isn't just the standard same responses can be really important. So we're going to switch gears again. This next portion, we're going to have you all watch a video that's, again, not something new, and just based on what it says right there, you can probably guess what it's going to be. You know, these conversations about bringing men to the table for ending sexual violence and challenging norms and, you know, being more involved in this type of work has been something that's been getting a lot of traction, both in our field and in the outside world. So recently, if you weren't aware, Gillette, the shaving company, I think that's what they do mostly. They probably do other stuff, don't know. But released a video on the best a man can be. So we're just going to take a look at that and then talk about it a little bit. Let us know if the audio does or doesn't work. That would be awesome.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual harassment.
Toxic masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Men need to hold other men accountable.
Smile, sweetie. Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool, not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men, we're acting like we gonna shake it.
and small.
I am strong.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay?
Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
All right. So, sorry about some of the audio difficulties for some of you. But if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you have a lot of downtime now that the semester's coming to a close to watch it. But really, this ad is something that I think is a really important point to where we are as a culture and a society in starting this work of really having men kind of think about, you know, what it means to be a man and what that can look like in not only just relationships, but also as part of just our human in society. Oftentimes when doing engaging men work, I think it's really important to be using things in programming or trainings that's timely, that's culturally relevant, that is something that's not worn out or doesn't make sense to students. And I think this right now is a really good example of that. I think this ad does a really good job of promoting a lot of leadership, role modeling, challenging some of these old traditional beliefs of what masculinity can mean, and beginning the process of opening up a dialogue around these issues. So we've used this video in a training book a number of times of, you know, just doing a domestic violence awareness 101 kind of presentation and adding this in to talk about gender roles and playing it to the group and seeing how students respond. And as one would imagine, there's usually a gambit of responses. So we pulled together some that weren't necessarily from our trainings, but have been some of the responses since this ad came out. Some comments just on the video alone talk about how Gillette's now trying to emasculate men, and that we need to just let them be, that they're now going to look into every single product made by the parent company, throwing them in the trash, never buying them again, and everyone involved in this ad should be fired. You know, a typical rational response. How Gillette now is encouraging men to shave their legs too, which is apparently a thing that no man has ever done before, and that it's offensive and insulting, implying that men only fight and barbecue and harass. I think that this is a small snippet of a lot of the responses when there's any form of challenging of norms or of culture. Some of the ones that are also out there, which is a really interesting narrative that people create, is that the ad is also anti-white somehow, which doesn't make sense to myself, but one could make an argument for it, I'm sure. But I think when we think about getting in front of groups of men specifically, how these things really can create a backlash and oftentimes get mislabeled as man-hating kind of things. But it's really important that when you're getting some of that backlash or some of that pushback when facilitating trainings, that you're able to kind of roll with that and find ways to take in what your audience is saying and acknowledge it, but then be able to pivot and shift the conversation to a healthy, productive one, which we'll start to take a look at in a second, in regards to how we view men as being part of this conversation and what types of roles we want them to be taking on.
Yeah, so this next clip that we're going to play is actually a trailer for a documentary coming out called The Bystander Moment. Jackson Cass is one of the producers of it. But for us, you know, coming across this and thinking about how this connects to this conversation is when we're talking about engaging men, I think one of the things we have to be really conscious and aware of is, are we coming at men as potential perpetrators of violence, or we are trying to engage them as leaders and empowered bystanders around the issue. And so we have to be really honest about how we are approaching men and engaging men in this conversation. And so really focusing on the bystander is an important piece of this. So we're going to play this. And again, check the sound on your computer. Hopefully you can hear it. But in good news, both the clips that we are seeing, you can easily access online. So.
The Me Too movement has brought sexual assault and domestic violence into the public conversation in a way that's unprecedented.
Harvey Weinstein, charged with rape and sexual assault.
Roger Ailes is out. Bill O'Reilly out. Matt Lauer out. Head of CBS is out.
And one of the most important things that's happened with the Me Too movement is it's not just shined a spotlight on perpetrators like Harvey Weinstein, but also the people around those men and the role that they have played in participating in the culture that produces this abusive behavior.
There was also an entire culture that supports
telling them to be quiet and silent.
How do you get the change of the silent bystander to move into that engaged bystander?
And in fact, it's important to remember that one of the most important developments in the field of gender violence prevention over the past quarter century has been this focus on the bystander. But it's really important to note that there are different approaches to how you work with the bystander. And it's crucial to think about these differences because they matter.
As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, Peter's pretending to be ill. How long before he gets help?
When people hear the word bystander, they think about how people don't act when they see someone in duress on the streets.
We'll examine the bystander effect and why it may have led people to just walk on by.
There's at least 10 individuals that are standing around watching this, and no one is intervening.
But the problem with talking about the bystander effect is that that has to do with strangers seeing something happening to strangers on the street. When we talk about the bystander approach, we're not talking about strangers on the street. We're talking about known peer cultures. We're talking about when they're in peer cultures where they know people, why don't they act?
2 high school football stars from Steubenville, Ohio, sexually assaulted a visibly intoxicated 16-year-old girl.
How could so many all-American kids stand by and let this happen without anyone calling for help?
And the reason why, generally speaking, why people don't act in their own peer culture is not because of their physical fear. It's because of their social fear.
Hey, let's go grind on some whores, bro.
When a young guy doesn't speak up and challenge his friend who's just made a sexist joke, it's not because he's worried about getting assaulted. It's because they're afraid of the social consequences, that they might be seen as soft, that they might be seen as not being one of the guys. Somehow their status within the peer culture might be affected.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Nobody likes a tattletale. Bros come before hoes.
So the question was, how can we change the peer culture support for abusive behavior, the kind of ways in which guys goad each other on, the way that guys enable each other's abusive behavior, but in particular, the way that men who don't support abusive behavior remain silent in the face of it. How does that silence function as consent and complicity in the abusive behavior? That's the bystander approach.
My brothers, I feel stupid, but I am just now realizing that a lot of us men in America have been raised on rape culture.
Yeah, so that video really kind of, I think, shifts our traditional language around the bystander effect to more of the bystander approach and how we can understand that. As Tiffany said before, like how we are viewing the men that we're working with. Are we walking into spaces and looking at a group of, say, male college athletes, and are we giving them the information so that they don't go out and do bad things, or are we giving them the information so that they can develop a higher level of empathy and care and concern about these issues and recognize how it can be a part of the problem-solving process? Jackson Katz has been doing this work for a while. If you're familiar with him, he was the individual who created the MVP model, which is a bystander curriculum that's often used on college campuses. And this is his new trailer for an upcoming documentary that he's releasing.
So, fun fact, this was a really cool slide that had all sorts of animations, and it's supposed to say common barriers, but it doesn't. So right now we're just looking at an empty construction site, which is fine. because there are lots of barriers that exist on a construction site. And we're going to make that smooth transition to how common barriers, or what common barriers do we experience doing this kind of work. And so some of them I think are pretty easy to identify, but I want to give us just a second, or people just a second, to share with us what are some of the common barriers that you are experiencing in your efforts to engage men in this work. So we'll give you like a minute. We want you to think about it. Please submit the common barriers that you are experiencing engaging men on your campus in this work. Please submit them in the chat box. Give you just a minute.
So just take a few more seconds for anyone who's still writing up a statement. All right, awesome. So that's amazing. You all turned in so many responses and such good ones. I didn't get a chance to read each and every single one because they came in so quickly. So we're just gonna go through and read them off really quick just to make sure everyone has an idea of what they were. We'll read off a few of them since you all turned in so many awesome ones. So a lot of people seem to sort of echo one another, that there isn't often a lot of, not a lot of people show up. I think that's probably for anyone who works at a campus doing this kind of work, trying to engage, the campus at large, students at large. That's probably a very, very familiar frustration for folks. Reaching folks beyond the first year orientation, that they don't show up, that maybe even schools don't have a lot of buy-in. And this one right here, this feeling that because you oppose sexual violence and rape, that you've done all the work you need to do, that's a really important one. This feeling that, well, I'm not doing this bad stuff, that I don't have to be part of this work, that I'm not the problem, that it's not as important as the laundry list of other issues on campus. Fear that if you engage in these topics, you may have to change and do some soul searching, fear of self-reflection, fear of what that might say about a person. So a lot of really good stuff here. Feel free to sort through and read for yourselves if you'd like. There's some other ones here along the lines of when being associated with the idea of a rapist. is something people might have anxiety or fear around, thinking that if they're in this line of, work, if they're doing that kind of prevention work, that that's what they might be associated with. Bisexual or gay males on committees, engaging cis males is challenging. So a lot of really great stuff. So thank you all for that, and I won't be able to read every single one, but I want to move on and talk about these barriers to buy-in. So this is all stuff that you guys have all touched on. So the important thing is acknowledging all these common barriers and then coming up with ways to break those barriers and change this narrative of the things that hold men back from engaging in this kind of work. So this involves in part engaging men not just as men, like we've talked about, but also just as human people who have a stake in this kind of work, for whom it's important to be actively part of this kind of work. So lack of awareness of the reality of domestic and sexual violence is a huge part of it. Resistance due to feeling like that will pose threats to masculinity or other privileged identities folks experience. We all experience our gender differently depending on our other sets of identities. Thinking that, I'm the nice guy, I would never do this, this is not a problem to me in my world necessarily, or at least in the way that I conceive of domestic and sexual violence, so I don't need to be part of that work. And then another barrier could be kind of this idea that if a person doesn't align with this hyper-masculine script, like if they're nerdy or geeky or effeminate, then they can't be misogynistic or have harmful behaviors, that even if they do exhibit those behaviors, it's almost funny because of the absence of that traditional script of masculinity. So all these things can be really definite barriers, especially in the ways that they manifest on the campuses or in the organizations where we work, in practical senses too. If we don't have a lot of institutional support sometimes, these can all be barriers to getting people to show up and to be, to show up. If they don't show up, then really what can you do? So that's certainly a barrier. So shifting the idea that this work is, a woman's issue to really understanding that it affects all of us and that we all have to be actively involved in it is incredibly important. So engaging men from the perspective of their leadership potential and how these issues do connect to their lives and do impact them, and engaging in that power and potential from a sort of positive lens that they can be people who create change in this way. So we want to open it up again and ask if you wouldn't mind typing in what has helped you in your work with engaging men. So just helpful things, whether on the schools where you work or the organizations that you work with, things that have helped you progress in this work. So has it been allies or advocates who have worked with you? Has it been existing groups that have had buy-in with this kind of work that you've been able to collaborate with? Whatever it has been that sort of helped you despite these barriers, if you wouldn't mind sharing them, that would be great to get a sense of where people's experiences have been with this. So just take a couple minutes for that. Awesome. Thank you all so much. So we're seeing some really great things here, great examples of things that have been helpful to you all in your work. I think we can all attest to the fact that wherever there's food, there's a draw for folks to attend. Consistent language is definitely helpful. Working with male leaders on campus, so really awesome.
So it's really important to, if we're going to talk about barriers, that we also acknowledge the things that we have done that we have found to be successful, so we don't totally lose track of those things. But always, keeping in the back of our minds that there is room for improvement, and we always need to stay aware and relevant and up to date on our information in order to continue to be relevant and connect with our audiences to keep them engaged. So we are going to move on to that exact piece, this idea of engagement. So rules of engagement, kind of a 101. And obviously, you could do a Google search, you can find this information, but we think it's really important to lay a foundation. And these are some really key things when we're talking about facilitation skills and leading a training. And tying back to some of the things that folks put out, when we asked about common barriers, someone had asked this question around how to create buy-in. And so one of the ways to create buy-in is you kind of showing your knowledge and your ability to engage in conversations, and not even just the easy conversations, but the difficult conversations. So if you can model how to have respectful discourse, that is a really positive way to get buy-in. So even though someone doesn't necessarily have the same opinion or is viewing the situation or topic the same way, there's a dialogue that is still able to happen because we maintain respect for one another while challenging what we're saying. So we broke this down into kind of 4 key points as far as what's important around engagement. So 1, introspection and self-awareness. 2, the ability to tell a story. 3, generosity, and 4, confidence. So what do these actually mean? So if we look at introspection and self-awareness, this is really about you as the facilitator, as a trainer, as a lead contact, whoever, you may be the person setting up, promoting an event, or, trying to get particularly male-identified students to come to an event. So for you to determine who you are as a speaker and as a person, and I know this seems kind of deep, and you're like, how dare you, Tiffany? You're not my therapist, which is fine. You are correct. I'm not. But what I can tell you, in my years doing this work, this is invaluable. For you to have a level of self-awareness and introspection as a speaker, as a trainer, is key. Like, it has to exist. It doesn't mean that you're going to figure this out right away, but you're constantly doing that check-in internally about who do I want, like essentially what is your brand, right? And this is going to get you the buy-in. And then what are your strongest interpersonal qualities? I tend to utilize my ability to use sarcasm to disarm people. I do that because I acknowledge my physical presence can often get people to detach or become defensive easily. And so I'm very much aware of how I present physically, and so I need to kind of make up for that verbally. So how do you best connect with others? Again, I tend to start with humor or sarcasm, but very easily being able to transition into another space. Like, I can go from being funny to being super serious, yeah. And then what qualities do you need to work on? Nothing. I'm so great at, no. But this is part of the introspection and reflection. What qualities do you need to work on? Right? I need to be aware of, how do I present when I'm tired? How do I present when I'm stressed? If there are a million other things going on at work, how do I present to my audience? And I need to be aware of that so I can balance it better the next time I'm presenting in front of that group. The next one, the ability to tell a story. If you haven't watched it, there's an amazing comedy special on Netflix called Nanette from a comedian called Hannah Gadsby. And in part of her Netflix special, one of the lines that she says is, you learn from the part of the story you focus on. It is extremely true and extremely powerful. And so when we are telling stories, we need to tell it in a way that what do we want our audience to take away from that story? What are we sharing? How are we sharing it? All of that matters. Are we telling people what to think and what to feel? Are we asking? Are we giving them the opportunity to reflect in that moment as we're telling a story? Whatever it may be. But this ability to engage your audience is really foundational, right? People come for the information, but they'll stay present in the conversation because of the stories that you tell and how you tell them. And if you can be engaging and informational at the same time, it's going to pay off in the long run. So this next piece, generosity, all of these these four foundational skills complement each other. But this generosity piece is you as the trainer, the person leading this conversation, being able to be vulnerable with your audience, to make that connection, to get that buy-in. So starting with the why. So why am I here? Why do I do this work? And this really ties into the importance of your storytelling skills, right? So if you're going to allow yourself to be vulnerable, and share a personal story about kind of why you are here, why you do this work, you want to be able to tell that story in a way that doesn't shift the focus, right? So the audience isn't feeling now sad for you, and that's where their focus is. They're still able to stay on point with the information that you're trying to connect to. So, this is recommended to do in kind of the beginning, right? So to get that connection started off strong, right? So I'm not just Tiffany, who is a campus project coordinator, right? I have a story around what brought me here, why I'm here, and why I choose to really continue to be here. And that why can then get you to the what, right? So this is why, and this is what I do with that, right? And then the next piece, and again, this was supposed to be a really funny graphic. If you've ever watched Anchorman, it's a funny scene, but your confidence is also really important. And we understand, again, this takes time to really cultivate and develop. And when we say confidence, we're not suggesting that you are arrogant in any sense, but own what you should, right? So if I mess up in that moment, I need to be able to oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that. Let me rephrase that and tell you the true word that was supposed to come out of my mouth. But that's a level of confidence, and your audience is going to pick up on that. If you, at any point, kind of shift in your tone and your inflection, because for whatever reason that insecurity has crept up, your audience is going to pick up on that. And so how do you kind of bounce back, right? And the confidence is key. So, and this helps if you allow yourself to be vulnerable with your audience. Look, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. And you just asked this really great question, and I wish I could give you an answer. But here's what I'm going to tell you is I don't know the answer, right? But what I can do is I can do some research and follow up with you. That kind of response in owning what you don't know is a level of confidence that you are modeling for your audience. And again, that helps you with the buy-in. So when we're talking about engaging, what does this mean specifically with engaging men? Christopher, can you tell us more about that?
I suppose that could be arranged.
Love it.
So to Tiffany's point, thinking about those kind of four key components of doing this work, and then thinking back to some of the barriers to maintaining that engagement. If you're only reaching men during first year orientation, or if you're only, hosting campus-wide events and you're not seeing a lot of men show up, thinking about how you can create a more consistent and comprehensive approach during all those opportunities can be really important. What is the core messaging that you're trying to put out there? Is it framed in a way that men are going to see the poster for this thing and naturally be wanting to go to that, or does it seem like something that they're going to say, that's not something that's relevant to me or that I would be involved in? So thinking about also some of the banned words kind of exercises and the phrases that we use to message this work. It's really important that we're not just relying on the low-hanging fruit groups, the easy ones that are very recognizable, like college athletes, fraternities, places where we know men will be based on just the type of organization it is. Are there other places where you can find groups of men with leadership potential? Does your campus have groups or clubs that might have more male participants? Are there like gaming clubs or a cappella groups or different cultural groups or student associations that you found men tend to be a part of? And making sure that whatever the group that you're going to is, you're finding a way to make it relevant to them so that they'll want you to come back. As Tiffany stated, once you kind of get them hooked, they're going to want to come back based on if it was something that was really interesting to them or based on learning their connection to this work. Again, we really want to push folks to think beyond just the traditional box of this is just stuff we have to change for students. If the staff and faculty aren't on board with that, what does it take to get them there? And having them involved being so crucial to that work as well. Oftentimes thinking along the same lines, are we just focusing on coaches? Are we just focusing on department chairs? Finding ways to get more types of faculty and staff involved is really important, and framing it in a way that will make sense to them. Again, going beyond just straight white men, when we say engaging men in this work, who are we really talking about? Are we being inclusive to other communities that these issues are often very prevalent in? The queer community, trans men, gay men, these folks need to be included in these conversations and be included in a way that's going to make sense to them. It's not going to make sense to always be framing domestic violence as men perpetrating these things against women. It needs to be framed in a way that folks who don't align with that can understand that and connect to it in a way that's going to make sense. Oftentimes we do that just by eliminating pronouns and stories, but I don't think that's enough. Finding different ways to do that kind of work can be really important. And finally, how are we also providing services to male victims? When we say engaging men, that tends to be on the prevention side of things, but it's equally as important that in all of our conversations, in all of our presentations that we're doing when we're oftentimes listing off resources or services that can be provided, that we're really finding ways to do that outreach to men as well. Thinking about the barriers to service that men have when it comes to these and the unique needs that they have. There's so much higher levels of support needed around some of the societal guilt and shame that goes around this, dispelling some of those myths and creating those realities for folks, addressing internalized homophobia that often comes for male victims and not wanting to follow through with services, either medical or legal routes, finding ways to at least recognize that these are potential barriers and developing solutions around how you can break through those barriers.
Thank you. So, how do we do what we do? This is us just giving you some examples of how we do this and how we do this successfully, but also, how, there's room for growth for us around this. Kind of some of our current efforts, things that we have in play right now, and then looking at a little bit of our data. So this first piece around how we prepare and implement. So really, when we get presentation request or a training request, we try to the best of our ability to identify who's going to be in the audience, what's the need, right? So for the person who is requesting the training or the program or the event, what happened? Is there an event that took place or a situation or a conversation that led you to reach out to us? It's good for us to have that background information. The more that you know as a trainer or the lead person, again, the better off that you are. So it's important for me to know if there was a situation that went down in your student government meeting last time that was problematic, so problematic that you reached out to us so we could provide a training on harmful language and the impact that has on healthy culture, however you want to frame it. And then we do our research, right? So part of the prep is for me to not only find that information out in the moment, but then I'm going to do some research online. What do I need to know about your organization? What do I need to know about your sorority, your fraternity, your campus that will help me in communicating this message, that will make that message more relatable and more relevant, right? Because what plays out, again, at one campus to one particular audience isn't necessarily going to work out the same way somewhere else. And then implementation-wise, it's really about, again, and I would argue that most people find themselves in the same predicament, right? Like you are working with limited funding, limited resources, and you're trying to make the best out of a bad situation, right? And so as, folks who work in the nonprofit arena, people are funded by different funding sources, and so we're having to fill in. So ideally, what we would love to see happen is you have a team, right? And I want to tap into two of my team members who have these strengths, and they complement each other well enough, and they're the ones who are going to lead this training. That is ideal when we're talking about implementation, but again, not everybody has that as an opportunity. So you work with what you got. So you want to go with whoever on your team has the easiest buy-in with that particular audience, and then you do the prep necessary, right? Again, all the things that we kind of touched on before with engagement and prep. And the next piece, so our current efforts, so we, this year, our awesome intern, Natalie, is currently in a sorority on her campus. And so we started off by providing some trainings early in the year to some of the sororities on campus. And then from there, engage them in a conversation around how do we train a couple of the fraternities that you interact with and come in contact with quite often for whatever reason, and give those fraternity brothers that same training. And then the culmination of that would be some kind of campus event where those groups engage in a campus-wide conversation. So, and this is the part where we weren't successful, is we provided the trainings to sororities, but we weren't able to get access to fraternities. So when we are thinking about next year and how we're going to start the year off, we're going to start those communications much earlier, especially with whoever can get us access to the fraternities. So that is one current effort. And so in the conversations that we've had with some of these sororities, it always comes up where they ask, does every chapter have to go through this? Are fraternities going through this? And so we are honest with them about, look, we would love to have a larger conversation and get access, but we're struggling here. But for you as young women on this campus who happen to be a part of this community, you have the power to create change, right? So we're really also motivating them to kind of step up their leadership and their, kind of empowered bystanderness, if you will, around, it doesn't just have to be us engaging these men. You also are in a space where you can have these conversations. So it also kind of opens the door for additional trainings that we can provide to those particular sororities. We also recently did a campus-wide event on one of our campuses, and although we can't take full credit for why the group ended up the way it did, there happened to be a large group of ROTC folks who attended the program, and we ended up collaborating with our local Planned Parenthood here to really have a conversation that focused on kind of healthy sexuality and communication, in transitioning into this idea of consent and how they both work together, essentially. So the conversation went really well, and so now we have a name of somebody within that kind of organization program on campus that we can get involved. And so now we're able to possibly get groups that wouldn't necessarily interact with one another to do that. So maybe some ROTC male-identified folks engaging with some fraternity folks on some campus-wide event. So those are some of the things that we are toying around with. Outside of those targeted approaches, when we are providing our kind of general programs, again, we're infusing those with information that allows the men in the audience to engage and ask questions. So it doesn't mean that you have to be this particular kind of man. As long as you are a person, this applies and impacts you. In addition to kind of the general programming, we are also implementing the MVP curriculum on some of the campuses, Lemoyne and ESF, which are two of the campuses that we work with. So far, we've provided a training for faculty and staff, and then at least a first round of training for students. And so the idea is the students who go through the complete training can then receive training on being a peer leader, which allows them the opportunity to create events that they think their peers will be interested in, also in leading conversations with their peer group around the issues. One of the campuses, so in our program, excuse me, outside of our campus projects, in our general prevention education program, we do engaging men work. And so one of the programs that we offer is our 12 men model, which is essentially you get, if you have a male-identified person, they express interest in this conversation, and they have other men that they want to invite to the table. So that one man invites 11 other, and that's their 12 men. And they go through a training, and then from there, the hope is that conversation continues. So you could get those men to, again, lead a campus event or a more intimate conversation. And there are a variety of ways to do that. Again, you identifying what the need is for your particular campus community is going to be really important. What typically gets your students to come out? What can you try to engage them in that would be successful? We can't say what that is. I think that's a part of where that reflection will be important. And then as far as our data goes, so for the 12 men model, we have specific numbers around the success of that program, but really focusing on kind of the background of the program, how we evaluate it. Are the participants getting the skill enhancement that we said that they would, impact on participant behavior and intervention, growth potential of the program, and then further program needs. As far as our general campus programs, when we look at our data, so on our evaluation, one of the questions that we ask is, did you learn something new about domestic or sexual violence or other forms of abuse from today's presentation? When we look at so for this academic year, 2018-2019, the overall responses, we had 1,034 evaluations, and that is including both male and female participants. So if we take out the female-identified participants, we're looking at out of 430 male participants, 288 responded yes to that question. That's 67% of our male-identified respondents said that they learned something new about the issues from our presentation. So as much as we would like to see that number to be much higher, for us, that is a success. 67% of your male-identified participants acknowledging that they did learn something and then sharing with you what that is a success that we can build on. And then how they typically rate our presentations. So out of that same number, we're looking at 70% of our male-identified participants rated us as excellent. And then the next one would be good, which was 25%. We only had 3% rate us fair, and then 0.2, which I'm not sure how that's a full person, rate us poor. So we know we have room to improve, but what we're doing right now, we also know is working with the majority of male-identified students that we are engaging with. And a lot of it has to do with how we do our prep and how we implement and how we work on our facilitation skills and leading trainings and being creative. So with that, we want to open this up to any questions around engaging men that we didn't really get to that you want to know more about or need help kind of working out on your end. So we'll give you a minute. If you have anything that you want to throw out as a larger conversation, please do so. We'll give you just a minute to start thinking about that and submit it on the chat box.
So one of the questions that's coming in, we're just filtering through some of these, is to talk a little bit more about the 12-man model group. So what that is, it's really a discussion-based training that brings together a group of men to have real and honest conversations around the issues. It asks if there's a question bank that we use. It's really more of a curriculum than it is a unstructured group. So they go through the process of the training and really men being able to have a space to talk about what these issues look like and mean for men and navigating their relationships and talking about that with other men in a safe and open space so that they're able to kind of get those questions, comments, and thoughts out that they probably wouldn't be comfortable doing in a mixed gender group. So they go through that training and have that dialogue, and then part of the challenge and the ask after going through the training is to have some of that leadership and finding other groups of men that they might know and pulling together more groups so that they can have kind of a ripple effect in how that looks, or in how we can get more folks to the table to have those conversations. There's another question here around, is anyone doing work with male students or any students for that matter that have been found responsible of a sexual misconduct charge? If so, what they're doing and what that education work is. So as an agency, one of the other, besides our prevention education team, one of the other programs that we have is our alternatives program. So alternatives is a program that's designed as an accountability program that typically tends to be folks who are mandated through the court system to attend this education-based program on accountability and addressing their own abusive behaviors, that has been very successful in that realm. Tiffany, do you know if there has been any students who have engaged in the alternatives program?
I don't know that, and I feel very confident in saying if a student did attend, I probably would know. But as far as the alternatives program goes, again, I think Chris was just saying that's typically something, a program that folks get mandated to attend. People can attend it by choice. It's extremely rare, but it has happened. And it's not something, honestly, right now that we necessarily promote on campuses, so I would be surprised if a student was aware of it unless they were mandated by the court. So. Someone requested maybe sharing the evaluations that we use. We can definitely do that. For us, that's also been an area that we want to improve and we want to grow. So if folks are interested in what that looks like for us, we can definitely share. I think our struggle with the data collection is, as much as we want to update our evaluation form, our database has to be prepared for that, essentially, that change. And that's been a programmatic struggle, outside of us as a campus team. So we can absolutely share that. But if folks have an evaluation that they use that they really like and would be interested in sharing that or willing to share that, that would be great.
There's another question here asking if anyone who's on the webinar would be willing to share any specific programs and or activities that have worked well within their communities. So yeah, if any of the folks on here are doing some work that they're really finding success in or wanting to share with us that we can share out to everyone else, you're more than welcome to do that. I think this is a really good opportunity to collaborate on some of that stuff and network on some of those things. Definitely. Yep.
Okay. So there's another comment up here. International college students seem to have a different culture. What is the best way to teach them that it's not okay to sexually assault women? So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. It's a really important, incredibly important area of focus to think really deeply about how to engage folks from different cultural and social backgrounds. I think what we want to be really, really intentional about saying is that there are a whole bunch of different cultures, both within the U.S. and across the world. And just like the U.S. is a country that is full of rape culture, there are, of course, countries with patriarchal norms and messaging all around the world. And the approach that we want to take is not that there's something inherent about sexual assault or violence to any one culture. That's not the approach we want to take. The approach we want to take is that, of course, in practice, there may be differences in how people with different backgrounds talk about these issues, and that perhaps partnering with an international students office or an office of multicultural affairs can be helpful in thinking about how to deliver that kind of messaging and have those conversations. But there really is no difference between trying to get any one group of men, be they international students or U.S.-born student athletes or U.S.-born student engineers or any group of men from any background. There is no real difference in trying to get them to not sexually assault women or any person. So it's all, again, going back to this idea of not approaching or of trying to shift our the orientation that we go into these spaces with, from thinking of men as potential perpetrators to allies and as people who are empowered bystanders. So just the importance of leading in with that positive lens be it a group of international students, be it any group of men.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we hit like the major questions that people put out. A lot of them had to do with kind of sharing resources. What are people doing that is currently working? Someone acknowledged that they used the MVP program this year for their entire athletic department and received mostly positive feedback from student athletes and coaches who went through the training. What I will say for that curriculum, it is facilitation based, which in my experience, being a facilitator of MVP is, that's why it tends to be successful, is because you're engaging the folks in the audience into a conversation. You're giving them some things to pull them in, whether that be a current event or an image or a quote, and then they're then invited to respond to that. And so it's not you standing in the front of the room talking at them. It's you really engaging them, active listening, being able to say back what they have just said, and then connect it to the content that you're covering. So with that, that is it for us. I mean, if anybody has anything else they want to throw out there, feel free in the last couple minutes, but if not, this 14 minutes of freedom is our gift to you on this beautiful day.
Any last questions? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I'd like to thank Vera House for this wonderful webinar, and you broke it down in such a clear and concise way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josie.
Thank you.
All right. All right, that concludes our webinar. Everybody have a great day. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.